So today we're going to start go foraging today, and it's something that I'm really focusing on here because I think that food independence is a very important thing. I think it's very important for us to understand where our food comes from and to understand that all food doesn't come from a grocery store, and so even along with gardening, foraging can really be beneficial for a lot of reasons. One reason is because I believe that foraging is not just an observation of nature and the world around us, but it's really a participation in nature and the world around us, which I think kind of puts you on a new level, a new appreciation. Another thing I reason it's important is because it kind of takes us back to our real basic needs, as members of this earth. No matter how far our advanced technology can take us, it can't really take away our basic needs of food and water. And I think it's important too, just because it's fun, and the more you learn, and the more you find out, the more appreciation you have, and what's more important than continually challenging ourselves and learning about the world around us. And so today we're going to look at a few plants, and I think there's a few things to understand about foraging, at least. One is that just because you say, "Oh, I don't want to forage," I'm not going to eat all wild foods or whatever. Just having identifying a couple edible plants and using them, every once in a while is, can be just as beneficial, as someone who, does it routinely. And so I would, challenge you just to learn a few and go out there and be able to identify them and use them. Another thing to keep in mind is that there is this myth that nature can be really fragile and we shouldn't take anything. Well, we can take some plants and things like that and food for ourselves, feed ourselves, but there are general guidelines to follow, and one of the most basic guidelines is just make sure you leave enough for the plant to continue to grow and regenerate itself and supply itself for not only next year but many generations to come. With a lot of leafy plants, the general rule is make sure there's enough in the area, and you never want to take more than a third of anything. Especially be careful with like roots and tubers and rhizomes and things like that, because that can affect a lot more than just that single plant. And I think the most important thing is always to don't take anything that I say here or anything as complete fact. Really learn for yourself and get out there and educate yourself. Because the best way to get out there is to build confidence in yourself, and the only way to do that is through education and hands-on experience. And so there are two authors that I highly suggest, and one is this book here, and this is by Wildman Steve Brill. The book is titled "Identifying and Harvesting Edible and Medicinal Plants in Wild and Not So Wild Places." I like this book for a number of reasons. One, it's very easy to read. It's not written for a botanist. It's written for, just for anybody. Another reason I like this book is because it's set up chronologically. So it goes throughout the seasons. So right now you can just flip through the spring season and everything's there for you. And a third reason I really like this book is because he's based out of New York City. And so I think there's another myth about foraging that you have to be out in the woods or out in the forest, but that's simply not true. Most of the books in this, most of the plants in this book are found within a 60-mile radius of New York City. So if you can find them in New York City, you can find them where you are, I'm sure. And so this is a great book. He also has great recipes and a great look into other things to do with plants besides just edible, but also other uses for them. The next author is the author of these two books. His name's Samuel Thayer. The books are The Forager's Harvest and Nature's Garden. It's basically the same. It's basically one book. It's just the Nature's Garden just covers a new series of plants that he didn't cover in Forager's Harvest. This is a much more in-depth look. It's very recommended. I would start with the Steve Brill, and if you do like it, get this. It's a little more specific to rural areas around the Great Lakes and Midwest, but it's very in-depth and very knowledgeable, and if you are into foraging, I highly recommend it. You can't go wrong. And a lot of the plants do overlap, but there's also a lot of great information. I find myself referring to both for one plant to get information. And so today we're going to go out and we're going to forage a little bit, and I hope you learned something, and I hope it encourages you to get out there and try it yourself.
So what we have here is a patch of spring beauties, which are those little guys right there. And what's happening is this other taller plant that is garlic mustard. You can see the garlic mustard comes in, and it's so prolific, it comes in and it just takes over this whole area. So these spring beauties are being crowded out. So this is a good patch of garlic mustard that can be taken out. And not only is it an invasive, but we can eat it.
So pulling garlic mustard is really easy. Actually, the roots come right out. You grab it right at the base and it just pulls right out. You can see you got the whole root and everything. And it's really important to pull. You can see the buds here right before the flowers open up, because then the seeds, you pull this plant before it seeds, then it's not going to spread. So this is the perfect time to pull. It's also the perfect time to eat, because as it gets bigger and older, the plant it becomes more bitter. The leaves are good just raw or in a salad. But my favorite part is this young shoot right here. It's a little less bitter, and it's also a little juicier. And so just steaming this or sauteing it like you would asparagus is actually quite delicious. So I'm going to collect this whole patch here, and this is going to be my lunch. So this is that same patch that we were just at in only about 5 minutes time. I've pulled all the garlic mustard out. I've got a nice sprig of stems here, so we'll go home and steam these up, make a meal out of it. And you can see we've kind of eliminated the garlic mustard, so we've allowed some more room for these spring beauties and the native wildflowers. Now, when it comes to invasive species, a lot of people have a really, really negative attitude towards them, like a deep-seated hatred for garlic mustard. It's not really its fault. It's just a plant doing what plants do. It was originally brought from Europe as a vegetable. So, especially with invasive species that can be edible, using them and eating them is usually a good way to, both get rid of them and have a little more positive attitude towards them. Now, some of the bigger garlic mustard plants have this big taproot like this, and this taproot can be ground up and used. It's like a horseradish, very similar. So it can be grated and put into vinegar and used as a horseradish substitute. And so that's another use for it. Now, it is important, if you see garlic mustard or if you have a patch of forest that is garlic mustard in it, if you want your native wildflowers to come back year after year and really thrive, it is important to pick your garlic mustard, because it is a huge ecological problem. It comes into an area and it can just take over and really push all the other plant species out. And so, I would encourage you to, make it a community event. Grab a couple people and just do a garlic mustard hike, where for one day in the spring you go out and you pull a lot of garlic mustard for a couple hours. You see, in just about 7 minutes, I cleared probably about a 20-foot patch, no problem. And then you can also learn a little bit about edible plants. So, this whole hillside is covered with spring beauties, and they're really prolific like that. They grow out of big root systems, and not only are they, as their name implies, a very beautiful flower, but they're also actually edible. Their roots come from big tubers, like the size of a small potato, and the tubers are edible, and they're actually quite good. However, in terms of foraging, this isn't very labor efficient. To gather up about a cup of these takes almost an hour, so definitely not recommended for the just kind of foraging hobbyist. But it is an edible.
Here we have the common blue violet. You see heart-shaped leaves, 5 petals in a butterfly fashion. Absolutely gorgeous. This is also an edible. It's actually one of my favorite edibles in the spring. The flowers and the leaves are extremely high in vitamins, especially vitamin C. It's also a blood detoxer. One important note about this species, though, is that the roots are poisonous. So the leaves and flowers, munch on. Roots, do not eat. And it's also gorgeous. Now you might be saying to yourself, well, I know this one, but it is not the dandelion. If you were thinking colt's foot, you're right. So this is a relative of the dandelion. However, there are a few subtle differences. One, unlike dandelion, this is colt's foot. The leaves don't appear until after the flower already dies. Also, whereas dandelions have kind of a smooth stalk, this has got reddish scales on its stalk. Now after these flowers die off, this big fat leaf will come out, and the leaves are actually used in a tea to cure just coughs and ease coughs. So this is a young jewelweed shoot. You can see it comes up in these two kind of kidney-shaped big smooth leaves. And you can collect them when they're this small and eat them, boil them. But I find it's better. I mean, I just let them get bigger because there's a lot more benefits to me when they're larger. And when jewelweeds do start to come up, we'll go into jewelweeds and the benefits of harvesting jewelweed when the time comes. Here's a really nice large patch of violet. That other patch was just a few individual plants, so I didn't really want to take anything from it, but from this patch I'm going to gather a little bit. One of my absolutely favorite plants to forage, the stinging nettle. Now, at first glance you may say this looks kind of like the garlic mustard. A couple differences. One, this plant is opposite leafing, whereas the garlic mustard has alternate. And here I'm going to show you garlic mustard. Also, the leaves of the garlic mustard, the one I'm holding right here, are much more heart-shaped than those of the stinging nettle. But the branching pattern, you can see the garlic mustard is opposite, the stinging garlic mustard alternate, stinging nettle opposite. Now, the stinging nettle does get its name because there are stinging hairs along its stem and on the underside of its leaves, which do produce a mild rash, mild sting that lasts for about 10 minutes. Now, this sting can be counteracted by jewelweed, which we showed earlier. Later on I'll show you how to make a jewelweed ointment that can be used to carry around that can also be good against poison ivy, but that's another episode. But they are temporary, and the stinging nettle itself is extremely valuable as an edible. One, it's extremely high in protein, one of the highest protein for any wild plant. Also high in vitamins C and A, and very high in the minerals calcium, potassium, magnesium, and iron. So this is really a forager's paradise, which is probably why it developed those stinging defense, because if it didn't have those, I'm sure it would already be eaten by deer and other animals. So it's probably a good thing for us that it has that defense. Now, when collecting them, it's probably a good idea to use gloves. unless you get used to the sting. One way you can do it too is just using your fingertips where your skin is a little rougher, and starting down on the plant and coming up with your fingers usually can avoid some stings. They're usually not too bad anyway. But what we're after is you want to get them when they're shoots like this, and what we're after here is about the top 2 or 3 leaf pairings. And then once you have those and you can collect them, you can do multiple things with them. One, any form of cooking will release the stinginess of them. So just, I find steaming them works best. Just steaming them for a few minutes, and you can use them in any dish just like you would use spinach. And it's just as, if not better, nutritionally than spinach. Perhaps my favorite thing to do with them is to dry them and then use them in tea and make a nettle tea or a vegetable broth out of them. And if you've never had nettle tea before, I highly recommend it. It's extremely rich. It's not like most teas. It's almost more like brothy. And especially in the winter, I try and collect as much as I can, because you can collect them early in the spring like this, and then other shoots will come up very late in the fall, and I try and collect as much as I can before winter so that I have a good supply of nettle tea for the winter to supplement some nutrients. And so I'm going to collect some, and then you can see the finished product.
Alright, so let's have a look at what we gathered today. First, we got our garlic mustard, which I'm going to take the shoots, and I'll probably steam some of them for a little meal tonight. I'll just freeze the rest, use them as I need them. I've got our stinging nettles. Now remember, with the nettles, you see I only took from the shoots only about the top 2 or 3 pairs of leaves. That's all you really want. That's the best part, the most nutritious part, and it allows the rest of the plant to grow. These I'm just going to put in a paper bag here and dry out, and then use them as I need them, either in tea or in soups, as broth, or just steam them and use them pretty much as you use spinach. And then here I've also got our violets. And remember, the flower and the leaves are the good part of the violets, but the root you do not want to use. The root is poisonous. And so these I will also dry out, and I will use them in salads, and then also in soups and in teas. So overall, it was a good day, and I hope you learned something, and there's going to be plenty of more foraging to come. Today's quote is a poem by Robert Frost entitled A Prayer in Spring. Oh, give us pleasure in the flowers today, and give us not to think so far away, as the uncertain harvest keep us here, all simply in the springing of year. Oh, give us pleasure in the orchard white, like nothing else by day, like ghosts by night, and make us happy in the happy bees, the swarm dilating around the perfect trees, and make us happy in the darting bird, that suddenly above the bees is heard, the meteor that thrusts with his needle bill, and off a blossom in midair stands still. For this is love, and nothing else is love, to which it is reserved for God above, to sanctify to what far ends he will, but which it only needs that we fulfill.